Instead, we have the opportunity to make a habit of empathy, to recognize ourselves in each other.
So I'm Zoe Weil, and I'm the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, where we offer the first and only graduate degree programs in humane education in the United States that cover the interconnected issues of human rights and animal protection and environmental preservation.
And what is humane education? What does that mean?
Humane education explores the interconnections between animal protection and environmental preservation and human rights in an effort to raise a generation who are solutionaries for a better world, who understand these connections and who perceive themselves as conscientious and engaged change makers to solve the problems that we face through whatever paths they pursue or professions they enter.
Well, I looked up the word humane, and it said it was like kindness and compassion. How do you define humane?
That's so great that you looked the word up, because I too looked the word up many years ago. I'd been a humane educator for a while, and it was always an interesting word because it was just the word human with an E on the end. And I sort of thought of that E as excellent or extraordinary or something, just giving a little boost to being human. Because you know, humans were the beings that were causing all of the problems that I was trying to address in my humane education programs. I used to go into schools and I would talk to students in assembly programs or after-school programs or classroom presentations about all of these different issues in the world. And humans were the ones who were perpetrating all of these problems. And yet I was a humane educator. So I looked the word up too. And it did say what you just said, but it also had this definition. Webster's Collegiate Dictionary had this definition, that the word humane means having what are considered the best qualities of human beings. And I loved that because it meant that what the education that I was offering was about inspiring in students the desire and the capacity to live according to the best qualities of human beings. So then what I did was I started asking my audiences, what do you think the best qualities of human beings are? Because I didn't want to presume that I had the right list. And it was interesting because over and over and over again, the lists were remarkably similar. And the number one best quality from all of the lists, the one that kept coming up more than any other, was the word compassion. And which is like empathy. And many other qualities came up too: honesty and integrity and generosity and kindness. And all of these qualities, of course, comprise what it means to be humane. And so that's how I define it. And interestingly, not a single person has ever said, oh, greed or materialism or violence or hatred. We all agree that those are not our best qualities, and we all agree that compassion is one of the highlights.
Can you talk about the relationship of empathy and compassion in your work?
You know, the words themselves, I use interchangeably. I see them in very similar ways. And to me, as a humane educator, there are 4 elements that I try to convey to my students. The first one is I want to provide them with accurate information about the challenges of our time. The next thing I want to do is I want to foster the 3 C's of curiosity and creativity and critical thinking. The third element is to instill the 3 R's, not reading, writing, and arithmetic, but of reverence, respect, and responsibility. And then the final one is to provide them positive choices and the tools for problem solving so that they can be solutionaries for a better world. And I see the empathy and compassion piece as really coming into play in that third element of fostering the reverence, respect, and sense of responsibility. That reverence is very similar to compassion and empathy. And I could put compassion in there as one of the C's, but I see them as connected. I see reverence and compassion as connected, as when we can appreciate, we can experience awe and wonder and appreciation for others, whether they are other species or other people or the environment itself, that actually cultivates our sense of compassion, our ability to feel with those others. And that leads to acting with respect and ultimately that leads to taking responsibility for our actions so that we don't harm and that we help.
So it's having a sense of awe from nature is...
Yes, awe and appreciation, wonder. Rachel Carson talks about wonder a lot in her work. People think of her as the writer of Silent Spring and bringing to light pesticide use in the United States, but she also wrote for children, and she really tried to cultivate a sense of wonder. And I do that a lot in my work as a humane educator. I think that while for some, the idea of justice and doing what is right or wrong is enough of a motivation, for many of us, it's really our love for others that ignites our action, that ignites our sense of respect and responsibility. And so when I'm working with students, I want to make sure that they have a sense of wonder, that they have that reverence, that they experience that compassion. And so I do a lot of activities designed to do that. And sometimes those activities could be really to experience compassion for another who is suffering. So for example, one of the activities I use a lot is having students of any age standing on milk crates, really, but they're just upside down milk crates, and they're simulating what it would be like to be a chicken in a battery cage, the hens who are used for eggs. And so I'll have them stand there for a period of time during a presentation, and then we talk about what that's like, and they'll be next to each other and they'll be crowded, they can't really move. Simultaneously, I might have another couple of students who are tying perfectly tight, even knots in a knot board that I've created, and they are modeling what it must be like for children in a rug factory who are working as slaves on looms, tying knots day after day, 12 to 18 hours a day, 7 days a week. So this helps to awaken their sense of empathy and compassion for either chickens on the one hand or children on the other. And there are many activities like this. But I also do activities to awaken their wonder. So I'll take them out in nature. I'll have them close their eyes, hold hands, and in pairs, one will introduce the other to the natural world and move their body carefully to get maybe under a tree, tilt their head back up, tap their eye to look up, and maybe tap their nose to smell something or put something in their hands. Maybe it could be a seed pod that they feel. It could be even hay, something that they just grass on the ground and they can smell it and they can feel it, all done with their eyes closed unless their eyes are tapped. It's called the Wonder Walk. It's an incredible experience because it's as if people are seeing the world for the first time, all brand new, and people describe it as just being an awakening. So if we experience those sorts of things, if we experience the natural world that way, if we experience empathy that way, it can't help but inspire us to make different choices in our lives that protect this earth or that protect those children and those species.
Well, that reminds me of as a child kind of backpacking or laying out in the woods and
Yep.
kind of looking up at the stars and that sense of wonder where it's
Yes.
just like, oh my goodness, what is this all about?
Exactly.
Yeah.
I remember that too. I was a teenager and I remember sleeping out on a baseball field and looking up at the stars with a counselor from my camp, and he would describe to me astrophysics and teach me about Einstein's theory of relativity. And I remember watching the shooting stars and thinking that it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. And the next thing I knew, I had tears streaming down my face. And they were tears of awe, tears of wonder.
Well, the part I'm really kind of focusing on is the empathy part. And
Yep.
It looks like role-playing is the way you kind of connect to the empathy, is get people to, or the students to really take on a role and put themselves in the shoes, I guess, of the experience
Yep.
of the animals.
Sometimes, and sometimes I'll show them pictures or I'll show them videos to make them aware. I'm always trying to use all four of those elements. I want them to have accurate information about issues of our time. I want them to think critically about it, and I want them to experience compassion and reverence so that ultimately they can make new choices. So I see them all going together. So yes, I will do role plays like that, or I will share film and I will share photos, all age appropriate. The other thing that I've done sometimes is an activity called a Council of All Beings, which really is a role play activity. Have you heard of the activity? Mm-hmm. So in this, I will bring students together, again, of almost any age, and I will invite them to close their eyes and through their imaginations become another being, usually a part of nature or another animal, and then to imagine themselves as this being and imagine what's happening to them as this being. And then they make masks to represent themselves, and then we end up speaking in a council together, and we talk about what's happening to ourselves as this other being, and we talk about what we want to change. And I also invite them to think about what wisdom do they have to share, and so they'll share that. So yes, another role-playing activity. It's very powerful. It's amazing how people they'll hold on to those masks for years and remember that being, and then want to live differently because of that experience.
Kind of teaching empathy through role-playing seems to be, a really great approach. Is there other ideas you have for how do we create a culture that has more empathy?
I talk a lot about social psychology experiments in my work as a humane educator, and there are a number of these experiments which demonstrate humanity's capacity for evil. And two in particular, the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment. And in the Stanford Prison Experiment, a mock prison was set up at Stanford University in 1971. And there were prisoners and guards. They were just students. They were just participating in a 2-week study and getting paid for it. And in this, very quickly, the prisoners started behaving in a sadistic and horrible way. Start again. The guards started behaving in a sadistic and horrible way toward the prisoners. And so one of the other experiments that was done was the Milgram experiments, and these were done in the 1960s. And they were supposedly testing the effects of punishment on learning by having a teacher who was being paid to participate. This was just somebody from the community who was going to be called the teacher, and a learner in another room. And the teacher would ask questions to the learner, and if the learner got the question wrong, the teacher was supposed to administer an electric shock from 15 volts to 450 volts in 15-volt increments. And this wasn't really a test on the effects of punishment on learning. This was really a test on the effects of obedience to authority. Because the professor involved, Stanley Milgram, would tell the teachers to just keep continuing to press these levers, even though the learner was talking about their heart condition, was crying out in pain, was begging for it to stop. By the end of the voltage, it got up to 450 volts, and there were XXX, and it said danger. And so if a teacher got all the way up to the end, the learner had at this point stopped vocalizing. So the teacher would think that they were actually seriously harming or killing that other person, because that person was either unconscious or dead at that point. Well, if you ask most people, what percentage do you think would have gone all the way up to the end? They're guessing a very small percentage. Even at Yale, where this was conducted, the graduate students, the psychology graduate students, were asked, what percentage do you think will go all the way to the end? And they said, well, only about 1.5% or 2% of the population would go all the way to 450 volts, thinking that they were harming and possibly even killing someone. The reality was that about 2/3 went all the way up to the end. So what does this tell us about empathy? It tells us that empathy isn't just something that comes from within us that we act upon all the time. Both of these experiments, the Stanford Prison Experiment and the Milgram Experiment, point out that we are very susceptible to the situations that we're in and the systems that we're part of. So to me, in order to truly build a culture of empathy, we need to make sure that the systems and the situations that surround us are ones that are humane and sustainable and just, because we will go with the flow. And if that flow is going to be cruel and destructive, that will suppress our empathy. That even though we all are empathetic, even though we all have the capacity for tremendous kindness and compassion and heroism, we can also go in this other direction. And so to build that culture of empathy, we have to work on making sure that the systems in place that people participate in every day, the food systems, the transportation systems, the clothing and product systems, are ones that are humane and sustainable and just. Because otherwise we're going to be hard-pressed to actually act according to our empathy. It takes a lot of effort for somebody to do that, to buck the system. And most of us can't do it in all arenas. So we have to work on changing those systems.
And what can we do to change the systems to make them more empathic so that they actually support
Yes,
empathy?
great question. And this is why I'm a humane educator. I don't know how to change every system. There's so many out there. You know, there's our food and water system. There's our energy and transportation system. There's our production system. There's our building system. There are so many, and there's our protection, our conflict resolution system. You know, we keep winding up in wars instead of finding nonviolent ways to solve that. Conflicts arise between humans all the time. I don't have the answer to how we change all the systems, but what I do have is I do have the method that we can get to that answer. And that method is humane education. That method is embracing a different purpose for schooling. So if we educate our students at all levels and in age-appropriate ways to understand what is happening in the world, and to perceive themselves as people who have to find solutions. And if our education serves these ends, I mean, you could have food and water as an overarching subject in a school year, and that all the other subjects, math and science and language arts and history, all serve that. We can be inviting students, again, of all ages, to think about how we change those systems. Some of them are going to go into politics. Some of them are going to go into business. Some of them are going to be healthcare providers. Some of them are going to be lawyers. Some of them are going to be architects. Whatever they go into, if they have had this sort of education and they understand that it's up to them to change the systems within their own chosen professions, then I think we will start to see these systems change. There isn't one way to change a system. It's going to require all of us. It's going to require all of our ingenuity, all of our creativity, all of our great critical thinking, and coming from a place of empathy and compassion that has been cultivated. So I think that it's really important to teach students about these social psychology experiments so they understand how influenced they can be. And then also teach them about the various issues that are plaguing us. You know, we have so many challenges: global warming and species extinction and factory farming and war and slavery and all of these issues. If they understand them and they are invited to use their great minds and to use their great hearts in the service of solving these problems, then we'll start to see the systems change.
But it seems like you need to start with like an intention. Like you need there needs to be an intention. We need a culture of empathy, or we need a culture of compassion, and then to be working towards that. You know what I'm saying? That frame to have the value. For example, we were told corporations are really for self-interest, and they're greedy, and greed is the most important value for corporations. And it kind of got out there in the society, and everybody just kind of takes on these messages that are out there in society.
Well, two responses. One is that, corporations do have to sort of meet the bottom line, right? Because that's their purpose as corporate entities. But there are people who are trying to change that system. So, for example, Robert Hinckley has been working on adding 28 words to corporate charters that essentially say that corporations can pursue profits, but not at the expense of, and then there's a long list, 28 words. Corporations, I believe, and the people who work in them and run them, would like nothing better than to have a level playing field where they all have to make sure that they are not causing harm. But because that doesn't exist, they're all competing. So that would be one way that we could shift that system just a little bit. Those 28 words could make an enormous difference for corporations. Because as I said earlier, when I ask people, and I have asked thousands of people, what do you think are the best qualities of human beings? Compassion is the number one quality that comes up. So I believe that we all have this within us. So how do we build that culture of empathy that you're talking about? I don't think it can be imposed. We all feel it. But there are all these systems in place that prevent it. And so we need to look at each of those systems. And corporations is one system that can be changed and can be shifted. We've watched things shift all the time. year after year after year. We watch things change. We watched women get the vote. We watched civil rights happen. We are watching so many people trying to make a difference. And they're making that, they're mostly coming to that from a feeling of compassion and empathy. So it exists. We just have to work it further. And I don't know that we can impose it from outside beyond cultivating it from within. And we all have it within. So we have to make sure that those systems don't prevent us from living according to our own deepest values.
Have you seen systems out there that are working, that are kind of fostering empathy and compassion?
You know, I think they're happening everywhere all the time. I mean, there are community gardens that are springing up, and there are schools that are wonderfully beautiful and empathetic. And I think that the challenge lies in dismantling very large systems that overlay so much of our life. So, for example, you know, we all know what it means to be kind, and people can be kind one-on-one all the time. But when you go to a supermarket or when you go to a store to buy your clothes, what does it mean to be kind? People have no idea what it means to be kind when your food is produced who knows where, when your clothes are produced who knows where, causing harm to others you will never see, and you just have no idea. So I think that the real challenge is bringing it home. Now, of course, while humans absolutely have this core of empathy and compassion, we also have other qualities within us that aren't so kind. And so we struggle with those. You know, there's a wonderful Native American story about a child saying to his father, you know, there are these two wolves within me, and one is greed and violence and hatred, and one is beauty and compassion and love, and which wolf is going to win? And the father answers the child, the one you feed. So we need to feed our empathy and not feed our violence. And that's hard because we live in a society where we're always feeding that violence, you know, through movies and music and all sorts of things. Video games, we're feeding the violence and sometimes not feeding the compassion, which is why we do so many activities to feed that compassion part of ourselves.
If you look over kind of the narrative of your life, how is your kind of awareness of empathy and compassion kind of developed? For example, did you grow up in a very empathic family, or was it something that happened that you gained some insights into?
You know, some people would say I was born overly sensitive, and I don't think that that's true. I don't think that it was negative in that sense. For me, I just was always very in tune to others' suffering. So when I heard about it or I saw it, it just wrecked me. And, you know, I remember being a child and watching certain movies where I just couldn't stop crying afterwards. And so that was just a big piece of who I was. And fortunately, I've found a way to take that part of myself and put it toward good use. Some people, I think, maybe are less sensitive in some sense, or may have cultivated that or not had that cultivated. But I was just born with it. And I think that there are a lot of activists out there in the world who are just born with it. And what's interesting to me sometimes is when I talk to others and I talk about some of the things that are happening in the world to animals and to other people, and they just don't seem to care. And that always shocks me because I don't know what that feels like. I've never not cared, just not who I am. But I recognize that people are different in that way.
In terms of the animal rights, I have a cause like Teach Empathy for Animals.
Yep.
But I also like fishing.
Mm-hmm.
So I got somebody kind of attacked me and said like I was a terrible person for fishing and killing fish. I was just wondering what you thought about that. I was just when I go backpacking, it's just something I grew up with. And it's so I connect with nature and you know and.
Well, calling anybody a terrible person because of a choice is really a terrible thing to do. I mean, really, who among us could not be told they're a terrible person for something? I mean, none of us is making perfectly empathetic choices all the time. Not even Gandhi was, not Martin Luther King, not even Mother Teresa. You know, we all are making different choices. The question that I would have for you is fishing really aligned with your value system? And that's a question for you to explore, because fish certainly suffer and feel pain. They have very sensitive nerve endings in their mouth, and when they bite into a hook, even if you release them, are they suffering? Yes, they're suffering. If they're pulled out of the water, are they suffering? Yes, they're suffering. And if in touching them, are you removing some of the protective oils on their body, even if you're throwing them back, are they suffering? Yes, they're suffering. It could make them susceptible to being prey. So it's a question for you to ask yourself. And it's interesting that you would bring it up, because maybe that means that you are questioning it right now. You know, it is something you love to do. You love to be out in nature. I'm imagining it feels quite natural to do. I mean, human beings have been catching fish for millions of years, right? So it's still a question. Is it truly aligned with your value system? And we're always asking those questions, aren't we? I like to think that we are. I mean, I'm always asking that question. And for me, I'll tell you what my Achilles heel is. I travel about once a year for a vacation. Now, I travel all the time for work, and I don't feel guilty about the effect that I'm having for work because I'm doing something good. But when I get on a plane and I'm going for a personal vacation, and I know the effects that all of that oil use is having on the environment, potentially on warfare, potentially on depleting a resource that at this point is disappearing, global warming, all of it. You know, is that really justified for me to just go on vacations where I fly? I grapple with that because it's not quite aligned with my values, but I really, really love to visit new places, and I really love to explore the world. And so that's the one that I've been asking myself recently. So all of us should be asking ourselves those questions all the time without judging other people for their choices. What I would ask everybody to do, though, is to really ask if they're living according to their values and what I call the most good, least harm principle. I wrote a book called Most Good, Least Harm. And that is a very simple idea. How can we do the most good and the least harm to ourselves, to other people, to animals, and to the environment through all of our choices? And I call it the MOGO principle, MOGO being short for most good. And, you know, why would anybody have to write a book about a principle that's so simple? Because it's challenging. It's challenging. And so every one of us can be thinking, am I living as deeply and as well as possible according to this principle?
Yeah, I think you already spoke to it. It's that judgment that I'm not so sure we can build a culture of empathy through judgment.
Yep.
And it seems to be more like if we want to build a culture of empathy, we need to empathize our way to a culture of empathy. So instead of judging each other, we need to maybe try to empathize with what it is that the person is feeling.
Right. And what I like to do is distinguish judgmentalness from judging, because we are all making judgments, and we need to make judgments. You know, I need to make a judgment whether something I want to do is good, is going to be most good, or it's going to be harmful. And so I'm making a judgment about it. I'm learning about it, I'm thinking about it, and I'm making a judgment. But that's really different from being judgmental. And I think that we can judge actions without being judgmental of people. We're all hopefully trying to do our best. And what I like to do is help people to do the best they can do.
And how do you do the helping? What's the helping?
The helping is humane education. It's doing what I've just been describing. It's offering accurate information. It's fostering the 3 C's of curiosity, creativity, and critical thinking. It's trying to instill the 3 R's of reverence, respect, and responsibility, and then giving people positive choices and the tools for problem solving. Only then can they make the decisions for themselves based on their own values. So that's what I try to give people through my work as a humane educator, through my books, through our organization, which people can find out more about at humaneeducation.org. And that's what we try to do.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.